how many of us are looping inside a PTSD-like trance every single day? We like to imagine that childhood trauma is something which stays in our childhood, but our current mental health crisis would suggest otherwise. In fact, the new science of interpersonal neurobiology has clearly proven the trance-like nature of unresolved childhood trauma and the kinds of cognitive distortions and everyday misperceptions that come as a result. To summarize, about 3 decades of research into brain science, trauma, and attachment in just 6 words, we are looping on faulty circuitry. So what does this mean for humanity? Well, a single instance of unresolved trauma, one person with twisted wires, that's a tragedy. An entire society, a collective mess of twisted wires, unresolved trauma, hypervigilant fragmented neural networks, and overstimulated ego defenses. That's a recipe for cultural collapse. We are swimming in the suffering which we have yet to resolve, and our reality will continue to reflect the agonies of our childhood until we decide to patiently and persistently rewire ourselves from the inside. Fortunately, it is possible to do this rewiring work, but it will require, again, a full spectrum approach to holistic healing, which is what we've been exploring in this series Inner Work Essentials. For this video, I want to focus in on the science and the brain science of traumatic memory, because I think it's the key foundational pillar in terms of unraveling the unconscious mechanics of trauma and cognitive distortion. To be more specific, in this video I'm going to be sharing more about unconscious memory, implicit memory, and procedural memory, which are 3 terms which are distinct but are basically the same thing, which all mean that trauma is a sensation-based distortion which comes up again and again until we go back to the implicit memory or the sensation which is yet to resolve. Don't worry about understanding all of this at this exact moment. I've got a whole video to explain it to you. I want to begin by kicking things off with today's Inner Work Essential, which is a marvelous piece of interpersonal neurobiology. It's the next level of clinical density, and it's The Body Bears the Burden by Robert? Yeah, Robert, not Richard. Robert Scaer. This book is not a fun read. Much of the book looks at whiplash victims and the mechanics of trauma and the consequences of trauma. But in terms of all of the books that I've read about interpersonal neurobiology, which again is the brain science behind trauma, people like Alan Shaw and Daniel Siegel are really good to read. But this book is the first one I'm recommending in this series because it goes into the nitty-gritty without being too technical or too superficial. We'll return to other books later in the series, but I want to read you a quote that will really guide us through. It will guide us into this territory, and hopefully a way which isn't too heady. I actually don't believe that we need to know every single mechanic of what every part of the brain does when it comes to healing our trauma. We just need the general concept. In fact, for my own healing journey, this only came after the major stages that I went through, which were very sensation-based. Anyway, a quote from the book, which interrupts, well, it doesn't interrupt, it introduces a way to interrupt the pattern. Again, from the book. The conundrum of trauma is the corruption of the present by procedural and emotion-linked memories of the past. So what he's saying here is that we're not seeing things correctly. In fact, the present moment is repeatedly invaded by the procedural memory contents of the dissociative capsules from past traumatic events. What he means here is that the trauma that we experienced as a child, in this example, that we dissociated from or that we defended ourselves from, continues to be stored inside of us as a frozen memory. And he says this explicitly. In the absence of the present moment, the trauma survivor's sense of self cannot grow and evolve but remains frozen in the time warp of the traumatic event. The survivor lives in a perpetual Groundhog Day of reliving the trauma as if it was still happening. This is the concept which we explored, I think, in episode 5 or episode 6 of this series with Peter Levine and his somatic approach to healing, somatic experiencing. These two books go together wonderfully. What I want to focus on is that idea of implicit or procedural memory, because what's happening in a traumatic moment is that we're storing sensations outside of a linear sequence or a rational understanding, which actually, to a large degree, becomes a very unconscious trigger system, a procedure, a procedural memory. I'll give you a few examples to make it obvious. Typical examples of PTSD typically split into two cases. You've got the chronic, which is a long period of traumatic experiencing, and you've got the acute, which is a short moment, such as a car crash. In the long period of traumatic experiencing, things like the smell of alcohol, if you had an alcoholic father or mother, the experience of perhaps being walked away from or left somewhere, maybe the experience of a door shutting, which is linked to a memory of being a child that when that door shut, mum or dad was gone and you didn't know where they were, or maybe the experience of hearing muffled voices from another room and there was some kind of argument or some kind of tension. These are the low-grade, chronic PTSD-like symptoms of many people that I work with and I've had to deal with myself, which are stored outside of a linear sense of understanding because, again, it was the sea of suffering that we were swimming in. What makes it difficult to focus on chronic memory as opposed to acute memory is that things are spread out over years as opposed to something like a car crash, which is a particular moment. There's a bee inside of here, suddenly, which is interesting. I might need to get rid of this bee. Can you see that? And it's gone. What a messy video, but I'll keep it raw. The thing with chronic memory and the thing with procedural memory is fuck. That's not something that you see on YouTube every day, right? Well, the truth is that I actually planted that bee to create a dramatization of what happens when implicit memory creates a procedure that triggers something traumatic and shutdown-like. It was all completely planned, and I definitely didn't have a very human response to being interrupted and not performing well. Just in case it's not clear, that was actually what happened. You saw it, right? And the reason that I'm keeping this in is I think it's a really raw and confronting demonstration of how implicit memory and the triggering that comes from some kind of subconscious blockage, some kind of subconscious experience can show up in our everyday lives. One way to read that situation, I just watched it back on my laptop, is that there was a moment of playfulness. There was a moment where I broke out of the persona or the part of my ego, which is a therapeutic support, a strong, confident teacher who can present dark, heavy material with clarity, lightness, and precision. See, I'm doing it right now. But if I allowed the playful part of me to come out, there's a bit more of an upwards inflection. I let the bee out, and I was really happy that the bee went really instantly. And I came back to the camera, and in that moment, I couldn't switch back into the performer role. I couldn't switch back into the teacher role. And I didn't breathe. I didn't pause and recenter. I noticed tension in my throat. I noticed a feeling of leaving the back of my head a little bit. And that's a dissociative response, and the reason that it triggered, I'm almost certain, based on my personal understanding of where I've been in my healing, is that there have been moments in my past where I have been hungry for attention and validation and being seen as someone who's doing it right. And in that moment where I stumble, that moment where I screwed up, there was consequence. There was a consequence for maybe not getting the grade or not saying the thing correctly. I'm sure you can read between the lines, and it might unfortunately be an experience that you can relate to. This is the nature of implicit memory in the everyday context. It's sensation-based, and rarely will we pause to realize, why did I shut down then? Why did I shut down so heavily from a bee distracting me momentarily? Well, it's because I have so much vested interest in performing well. That's my role. In this moment, I'm trying to communicate clearly with you. But beneath that layer of a very healthy aim is actually something a bit more unconscious, a bit more conditioned, and a trauma defense that is the archetype of the performer. Enough about me, though. I wanted to keep that example in because, yeah, it's raw and it's real, and the way that things like perfectionism or performance or hypervigilance or a desire to say things correctly shows up in our everyday life does, again, link back to those kinds of experiences from a chronic traumatic environment which we swim in. Our body remembers. Our body doesn't forget what it was like to be in front of a parent or a teacher, speaking, stumbling, and then the class laughs or the teacher gives a disapproving look, and we are hungry for that attention, that attunement, and beneath all that, love and acceptance. This is the real inner work. It goes back beyond the perception of just, oh, I screwed up, and yet it's very difficult to unravel. So what can we do? What can we do when it comes to understanding this brain science, understanding the nature of traumatic memory, and actually moving beyond it? Well, again, I would recommend that you read this book for yourself, The Body Bears the Burden, because clearly I have gotten aversion to actually talking about the science of human emotion and the science of traumatic misattunement. I'd rather have an organic moment of going astray and psychoanalyze it in real time for you, because I think it makes a deeper emotional impact. This video was meant to go a very different direction, but it does come back to my core understanding of how to work with traumatic memory, and that's awareness first. Again, in the healing arc, as I mentioned in a previous video, I think the subtle art of mental health, awareness comes before acceptance, and acceptance then moves us towards the actions of wholeness. So for example, in my current case, I had an awareness that I had a deeper shutdown response than just my video was interrupted and then I have to re-record it because I value single takes without editing. The acceptance of that is breathing through it, taking a break, and then still presenting it to you as a living example where I'm not afraid of being seen in messiness and humanness and outside of a perfectionistic defense mechanism, which isn't really who I am. I am messy. I do make mistakes. And when my playfulness comes up, sometimes my attention goes and I can't maintain a certain charisma or a certain persona. And then the moving towards wholeness, the actual action which is taken, I of course shared it with you, but in the case of trauma more generally, in the case of taking traumatic memory and shifting it, all I want you to focus on is awareness. It's asking questions like, wait a minute, why am I responding like this? Why are my upstairs neighbors speaking and talking, triggering such a sense of anxiety inside of me? Why do I feel so much dread when I'm in a grocery store and I go past the perfume section? Why does wearing a certain type of clothing or hearing a certain type of music or even certain words, certain facial gestures trigger such a deep, unsafe, helpless response? It all goes back to unresolved childhood trauma. There's a part of us which remembers. There's a younger part, an inner child, who remembers what it was like to receive that look, to smell that sensation, or to be met with a certain relational moment which might be a repressed memory, but more likely is just an everyday chronic experience which gets stored as a baseline emotional reality that's literally wired in our head. The research points towards the right brain being responsible for some of these traumatic misattunements, but again, you can read someone like Ian McGilchrist and his incredible book, The Master and His Emissary, to see how some of these myths about left brain and right brain aren't necessarily accurate. It's a very good book to read. Nothing to do with this, or something to do with this video, but you can go into that yourself. The core idea that I'm saying is awareness of the possibility that we might be a little bit twisted in our wiring, that maybe the person that we're relating to, our colleague, our partner, doesn't have malicious intentions for us. Maybe we're seeing their face in the wrong light. That's the first step. The second step is somatic resolution. This is the idea of releasing that charge. I've explored it many times in previous videos. I will explore it in a whole series in the future. For this exact moment, I'm doing what I did just then when the video got a B interruption. I paused. I breathed. I acknowledged that I was upset. And then I took action. There wasn't an internal shaming voice. That's not something that I experienced so much, but I did notice the sensation. And the sensation for me was a tightness in my chest, a constriction in my throat, a bit of a pressure in my eyes, almost like I would cry, right? How embarrassing to say. Imagine if I had cried because my video got interrupted as a grown man. And yet, I'm tuned into the sensitivity that is the spectrum of crying. I'm probably, almost certainly, hopefully not going to burst into tears because my video got interrupted. But you can see the emotions that extend towards that outcome. The very small feeling of that moment there can become tears. It can become shut down. This is where real emotional intelligence comes to play. Somatic release work. It's changing the imprints at the core emotional level. I'm not going to go into too much of it for this video. In fact, I'm going to invite you over to the next video where we're going to look at the realistic timeline for inner work and how to take the imprints that we've been talking about today, the unconscious memories and traumatic experiences which are stored beneath our awareness, and understand just how long it will take to fully heal from these kinds of problems. Again, next episode of Inner Work Essentials, we're going to look at the timeline of inner work and self-healing and how to take everything that we've been exploring in the last 15, 16 episodes and put it on a tangible timeline of action. I'll see you over there.